This is Cow, the podcast. Yeah, hi there, and welcome to Cow, the podcast online. I'm Ant Biggs, and I'll be your host for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, taking you on a trip into that strange and wonderful landscape of this here podcast. Stay with me. If you just want to come by and comment or say hello, same place, Cow, the podcast online. This week, a tangled web, and at the center of it, a place I come back to time and time again. A look at the world of physics and its recent history. Yep, we're looking at the world of physics, its recent history, that quest to describe our physical reality, and then a dip into the cognitive sciences and evolutionary neurology to point out how they might relate to recent developments. QBism, for example, a branch of quantum physics that's attempting to rewrite the equations from the position of a subjective observer. This is where we all come to in this day and age to understand what's going on. Ultimately, we need to turn to physics. Before we do, though, if you're a regular listener and you're feeling generous, you can find out how you can support Cow the Podcast by going online, again at cowthepodcast.online. Be grateful if you do. Thankful to those who are supporting us right now. Without you, we couldn't do this. Okay, I guess no one would want to argue with me if I say that quantum mechanics is where it's at in this world of physics. No doubt we've had a load of technology out of it over the last 100 years. That would be the smartphone, computers, lasers, MRI scanners. So we're using it every day. But in an earlier episode, we saw how we might be led to the conclusion that the story of physics, the story of discovery that brought us quantum theory, that story of a higher quest, the living embodiment of the Enlightenment, quest for absolute empirical truth, might have reached its end. And we've looked at the underlying fundamental question facing this narrative. We've dipped into the conflict between the material and the ideal, the idea that maybe we cannot even ever know the truth of our perceptions, our own perceptions, the idea that there's no certainty to be found in our observations, and that we cannot know we're looking at real external space or if we're just translating something else, essentially deceiving ourselves. And the physical description of reality provided by quantum physics, that doesn't help. Firstly, it's given breath to a myriad of existential models ranging from the multiverse theory to the string theory. Even though we're not up to speed on the minutiae of these, somewhere at the back of our heads, we've gained the idea that what quantum physics says about the world is pretty wacky. The existential certainty that we rely on, the objective reality that it anchors for us, in many ways just gets brought into question, time after time. Flowing from the basic tenets of scientific endeavour, there's an argument that it's not the place of science to answer questions of morality or behaviour. It's not within the remit of science that conclusions of ought should arise out of descriptions of what is. To counter that, though, as I will, is to point out a danger in that we are implicitly asked to turn our backs on our own human responsibility, the responsibility that we may express through our own interactions and behaviours. Within the idea of scientific objectivity, it is implicit that the philosophical questions of morality or ethics be shut down and left unheard. But this needn't be unchallenged. As new technologies expand our horizons to include work in neuroscience and evolutionary modelling, sciences that have only begun to take shape in the latter part of the 20th century, perhaps we could begin to make more accurate conclusions and informed decisions about how we do operate in the world and what our place in it is. So, first up, it was only at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and that's not so long ago, that there were concerns about Newtonian or classical mechanics, all that Apple and gravity stuff that we understand to be, in inverted commas, the truth. And these concerns stemmed from a model developed by a Newtonian classicist or physicist named James Clerk Maxwell, who had managed to unify the phenomena of light, magnetism, and electricity with his theory of electromagnetic radiation. About 1860, of course, this was great stuff. Just like we have our lasers and MRI scanners out of quantum mechanics, so in the 19th century came electrical power, light bulbs, telecommunications, and so on. The foundations of today's technology, but there was a problem. What happened was that Rutherford and Bohr came along with a model for the structure of an atom. the model of an atom composed of a positively charged core surrounded by negatively charged neutrons. And that's all well and good, of course, except that under Maxwell, his theory of electromagnetic radiation showed that the energies in this description just didn't add up. Huge amounts of electromagnetic radiation would be given off, and electrons would just be thrown off at random. The energy would just fade away. Be too quick, and atoms would essentially instantaneously just collapse. So we can see this was an acute problem. Science had a crisis and needed a complete revolution. Enter, quantum mechanics, the essential difference being that the classical laws of physics are deterministic and quantum mechanics is not. From the Copenhagen interpretation that they got together in 1927 to explain quantum mechanics, it says, physical systems generally do not have definite properties prior to being measured, and quantum mechanics can only predict the probabilities that measurements will produce certain results. The act of measurement affects the system, causing the set of probabilities to reduce to only one of the possible values immediately after measurement. This feature is known as wave function collapse. So quantum mechanics relies on probability for its predictions. It says we can only predict possibilities or probabilities in answer to the questions that we ask. And it incorporated wave-particle duality, the concept that particle behavior may be described in terms of both waves and particles. In so doing, it solved the problems that had been found to exist with classical mechanics. According to Einstein, though, it seems as though we must use sometimes the one theory and sometimes the other, while at times we may use either. We are faced with a new kind of difficulty. We have two contradictory pictures of reality. Separately, neither of them fully explains the phenomena of light, but together they do. This changed our understanding of nature in fundamental ways. It answers problems we had with our understanding of physical reality and gives us powerful new technology and tools and insight, but it turns our picture of reality on its head, especially if we're familiar with the ideas of superposition, quantum tunneling, spooky action, ideas that challenge our notions of time and space, the speed of light, and the basic solidity of even the earth that grounds us. What quantum mechanics is telling us doesn't fit with what we experience, doesn't fit with our measurements or with our common sense. I recently found out that given enough energy in a system, quantum mechanics can describe the behavior of every kind of particle, not just the stuff at an atomic scale. We're talking planets, cars, people, insects. It's not just the tiny stuff. Quantum mechanics, it turns out, mirrors Newtonian prediction for all but the most tiny of systems. Its brilliance is that it swaps from Newtonian physics only when it gets stuck. But the idea that cars, horses, planets, universes, just like big particles, are capable of superposition or spooky action seems absurd, and the challenge to our belief systems equally demanding. How we perceive the world, for example, is this. Let's ask the question, how do I know there's a glass of water on the table beside me? This is what physics attempts to answer. And the classic answer? How about this? There is light in the room, light bounces off the glass of water, the light is modified and reflected. Some of the modified light enters my eye, the light is focused on my retina. My optic nerve becomes excited, chemical, electrical signals are modified in my brain and my brain sees it. Or at least is minded to know the glass is there. Without going into the finer points of perception and consciousness as yet, which we'll come to later, we can be clear enough to tell a story of electromagnetic and electrochemical cause and effect, and to say that our brains enter a mind state that corresponds to the belief there's a glass of water on the table beside you. Now, this is essentially just another narrative. Philosopher of science David Albert uses this as an example. But it's a narrative that science or physics at least is deeply committed to. As he says, we believe our experience, our empirical evidence. Common sense tells us of its truth. Any theory of physics essentially needs to back this truth up. Every one of the steps in our glass of water narrative needs to occur in accordance with whatever the fundamental of laws of physics happen to be. Now, if they're going to be quantum mechanics, then you have a problem. Imagine one of the single photons taking that journey in the room, bouncing off the glass and bringing that information to your brain. It would seem reasonable that we may ask where it might be at any one instant. We should be able to track that particle, no? But it turns out we can't. Routine experiments which scientists do every day, simple experiments verified day after day, where an electron or any other particle is fired into a black box and comes out of the other, makes a nonsense of the question. We have all of the equations we need to explain the fundamental laws of motion, and these are very successful, as we've seen in our MRI scanners and our mobile phones, but they describe a quantum state for a particle called superposition. This is when a particle is in a position that is neither here nor there nor anywhere specific, essentially probabilistic field. And these equations actually predict that when we become the observer of the particles, our brains should go into superposition too. Now, to go further, when these boxes are actually ripped open, we don't find the probabilistic field anymore. We always find the particle. So why should that be? Why should it be that there never fails to be a fact about where we found the particle? We know from the equations, the very successful equations, that there is no position, only superposition, but we find position. We rip open the box and we find the particle on either route A or B, not stuck between them, hovering in and out of existence, not here or there, or here and there. It never looks fuzzy. We don't get dizzy and faint, fall over. So arising from this empirically gathered evidence, there's a standard consensus that the particle must exist in such a form that asking where it is must amount to be making a basic category mistake. We're saying that everything we thought we knew about the world has been misunderstood at a fundamental level. A category mistake, by the way, is a philosophical idea originally posited by Gilbert Ryle in 1949. Like a semantic error, whilst you may be able to put the words in that order, it doesn't mean you made sense. Or in this case, to ask where the particle is to fundamentally misunderstand its nature, like asking what the politics of a tuna sandwich might be. And it seems that this flat-out contradiction between the predictions of the quantum mechanical laws of motion about what happens and our everyday experience of what we perceive happens might be telling us that there's a problem with this science. Something's missing. So we can question the science, but increasingly we're beginning to question our perception. To leave quantum behind for a moment, I want to point out how some new research and theories within the cognitive sciences may help unpack the problem. If we try and define common sense, for example, from an evolutionary standpoint, we might understand its fitness and therefore its success over time, and to understand our perceptions and our minds in a similar way would appear to make sense. The problem with the standard view, however, is there is a mistake to conflate fitness with accuracy or truth. Must natural selection shape us to have conscious experiences that truly, inverted commas, reflect a state of external reality? Or might this be reification, a logical fallacy where something, simply an idea, is mistaken for something concrete or real? The evolutionary argument is that those ancestors that were unable to see a clear reality or truth were at a disadvantage. They were less likely to survive to maturity and were therefore less likely to breed. This failure to see absolute truth would result in the deselection of their kind. The problem with this argument, however, is in assuming abstract truth is an essential factor of fitness. This is not accurate. To counter this is to see that this standard view misses a number of key elements in evolutionary theory. Firstly, fitness and truth are completely separate concepts. Evolution has never been concerned with truth, and fitness never required it. Secondly, the idea of an abstract or even absolute fitness also makes no evolutionary sense. So if there was to be an abstract truth and an abstract fitness, there would only be one way forward. I mean, within fitness, it's a movable concept in which the present state of the organism, present state of the environment play equally important roles. There needs to be adaptability by definition, different truths at different times. Don Hoffman, neuroscientist, gives a great example of this by talking of steak. To a hungry lion, a hunk of steak has great fitness. It's less fit for a lion that's just eaten. To a cow, it's next to useless. Fitness may develop over time in relation to different factors, but there is no abstract, absolute fitness required that can be equated to truth or reality. And from a neurological standpoint, we've looked at recent research that suggests how our brains are pre-programmed with certain basic primitive frameworks upon which we build highly individual emotional and moral narratives, through Lisa Feldman Barrett and Jonathan Haidt, for example. Maybe this is the case of perception, the relation of the observer to reality. Study of evolution now has an advantage of having access to vast computing power, enabling modelling of scenarios that were once impossible. And with an understanding of game theory, it's possible to map evolutionary pathways with amazing accuracy. Simple mathematical processing, just lots of it, based on chances and probabilities. And any world we want created, in that computer we can create, and any organism and any perceptual system we want, tailored just the way we want it. We can ask the computer what happens and how things evolve. And Hoffman has done it, modelling simulations where some organisms see all of the truth, some see some of the truth, and some see none of the truth. When these evolutionary simulations are run, the result is that truth goes extinct every time. In reality, truth does survive, but only when it's programmed to be monotonic with fitness. On the face of that, we might conclude that only absolute truth should give rise to fitness. But this can't be the case. A monotonic function is one in that the more you have of it, the better. So unless truth and fitness are essentially the same thing, where truth would be synonymous with fitness, then truth loses. Always through evolution, fitness wins. Truth, like water, is not a monotonic function of fitness. For example, water means if you have no water, you have no survival. That's fair enough. If you have a bit of water, better survival. But for something to be monotonic, it means the more water you have, more survival you would get. Well, essentially, we know that's not true. We'd all end up drowning. So we come to understand water is not a monotonic function of fitness, and neither is truth, and neither a substitute for fitness. For a real-life illustration of fitness surviving over truth, Hoffman turns to nature, to the Jewel Beetle. This is a creature that has survived for millions of years in the outback of Western Australia, its habit being that the males fly around looking for a flightless female. That's what they do, and bigger is better. They find one, they land, and they mate with her. Fair enough, a simple story of survival, but the Jewel Beetle story got complicated, so much so that the Australian government had to get involved. It turned out that to a male Jewel Beetle, a discarded beer bottle turns out to be pretty much the sexiest thing on the planet. Like a female, it's glossy, brown and bumpy, little dimples at the base, and it's big. As we know, in Jewel Beetle terms, that's hot. So the males swarm them and all but ignore the females. This was a creature, a beetle that had been around for millions of years, and it was on the brink of extinction before the government stepped in to do something. On the face of this, it looks like the billion-year-long success story of the Jewel Beetle shows that they knew just about what they were doing. They must have had a pretty good grasp of reality and therefore truth, so that what they saw and felt and acted upon was fit for purpose. The beetles knew the truth about what a female was, so thanks to evolution for natural selection and the empirical truth. But the appearance of the beer bottle reveals that ain't what was happening. The fitness to survive was more likely the result of a trick, a twist in a circuit board, bringing brown and glossy bumps and whatever else together in a hormonal soup that said, bigger the better, go for it, boys. And we gain from this, evolution gives us perceptual systems efficiently enough, but you can't say that they're here to tell us the truth. They're tricks and hacks, heuristics and projections, simple mechanisms that have been selected to make reproduction happen. What this means to us is that our perceptions may well be a great guide for keeping us alive, very useful for fitness, but if we're to think they're giving us an insight into the ultimate nature of objective reality, then we need to be very careful. Moving on from this understanding of this process of reification that exists within all of us, Hoffman recognizes implications for how we do understand the world and further argues that all perception is essentially just providing a desktop to reality, like a computer desktop, an interface, which allows us to see only what is necessary to make our everyday tasks possible, enjoyable, and shields us from unnecessary complications. He talks of evolutionary arms wars as wars waged between differing interfaces like moths and birds, lions and zebras. As an aside, it might be possible to extend this analogy to include beavers and dams, man and environment, religions and faith, systems. But Hoffman's interest is to note, as does common sense, that it's impossible to calculate consciousness from our existing narrative of physics. But by starting the other way round, it can be shown how the maths can resolve a load of problems. Hofmann is able to mathematically calculate quantum mechanical phenomena, to reproduce mathematical formulas and answer them with the use of a simple mathematical construct representing a unit of consciousness, what he calls a conscious agent. So I've argued here that we know that physics, our single most powerful tool for understanding the nature of reality, has a history of fallibility. It's a roadmap of hacks and heuristics, possibly, that has helped us survive, no doubt, and thrive, but from the perspective of being, the objective journey into the truth and the abstract reality, we might as well have been staring at nothing more than beer bottles in the desert. Couldn't resist that last statement. I'm not denying the usefulness of the interface of our computer desktop, the technology and what we've achieved. I'm just saying that the new way forward may be inward. I want to talk about QBism, a new approach to quantum mechanics that starts at this other end. In QBism, like Hofmann's conscious agent network theory, the approach is from the other direction. It draws on the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, yes. This is using a personalist or subjective treatment of the probabilities that appear in the theory in order to properly align it with a kind of realism they call participatory realism, wherein reality consists of more than can be captured by any simple third-person account of it. For QBism, or for quantum Bayesianism, from which the name comes, the central concerns of the theory are the actions and experiences of an agent. The viewer must be included in the calculations. It was Thomas Bayes, who died in 1761, who first developed the concept of probabilities being a measure of subjective belief. And his ideas were later developed to include Bayes' theorem, alternatively Bayes' law or Bayes' rule, which describes the probability of an event based on prior knowledge of conditions that might be related to the event. For example, if an illness is related to age, then using Bayes' theorem, a person's age can be used to more accurately assess the probability that they have that illness, compared to the assessment of the probability being made without knowing the person's age. It gives us a different probability, usually one much lower than we expect from other methods of analysis. From Wikipedia, according to QBism, quantum theory is a tool which an agent may use to help manage his or her expectations, more like probability theory than a conventional physical theory. Quantum mechanics, QBism claims, is fundamentally a guide for decision-making, shaped by some aspects of physical reality. The mechanism is that all probabilities are valuations made by an agent. They represent the degree of belief the agent has in a particular outcome, and these outcomes are personal experiences for the agent gambling on them. While different agents may agree upon the consequences of a measurement, the outcome remains essentially individual, and any measurement apparatus is considered a tool and a part of the individual, an extension of the individual's perception system. It's essentially a method for turning statements of subjective belief into mathematically solvable equations. The magic, just as in Hofmann's conscious agent network, is that with its use, many of the problems of quantum physics begin to disappear. We no longer have to think about the field of probability as an actual reality. We don't have to explain why the particle is in two places and any place all at the same time, because what we are seeing is an explanation of our expectations, an expression of our belief, not a statement of concrete reality. Once we open the box, of course we find the particle. As part of the expectation, our knowledge has been updated. The chances are now not a probability field, but our chances are 1-to-1 of finding it in that place. 100%. Maybe this should be an avenue we do pursue, especially in the light of the building research in the cognitive sciences that begin to underline the process by which we build a conscious world. Physics essentially represents the battle between determinism and free will that has been raging for many centuries. We're going to take a look at that next week. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I've been Ant Biggs, and this is Cow the Podcast. Please drop by to cowthepodcast.online, say hello. Look forward to seeing you next week.